Imagine being in Emma's shoes, a 13-year-old girl who, after losing her mother, is forced to handle life on her own. What should have been a simple day of grocery shopping turns into a humiliation at the hands of a racist police officer. Emma is treated as a suspect simply because of her skin color. But when her father, a respected army captain, arrives on the scene, the tension escalates and uncomfortable truths come to light. In this video, you'll be moved by Emma and her father's fight for justice in a world that often insists on treating them as invisible. Get ready for a journey of pain, injustice, and the redemption they so deserve. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains of the small house, casting soft shadows on the polished wooden floor. The distant sound of traffic was muffled by the thin walls, and in the kitchen, 13-year-old Emma Jones stirred her cup of tea slowly. Her gaze, fixed on the window, revealed a mixture of concentration and weariness. Even at her age, Emma carried a demeanor that didn't match her youth. Since her mother's death, she had grown used to taking on responsibilities far beyond her years. Today, her task was simple: get the groceries for the week at the local market. She sighed deeply, feeling the weight of daily life on her fragile shoulders. A gentle breeze blew through the open window, making the curtains sway and bringing with it the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. Emma closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the comforting warmth of the sun on her face. Today is going to be a normal day, she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself. Before leaving, she glanced at the picture frame on the side table. The photo showed her father, Oliver Jones, dressed in his military uniform, with a proud smile on his face. He was an army captain, a man who dedicated his life to work, often absent due to long hours at the barracks. Although she knew he cared deeply for her, his presence at home was sporadic. "I'll be back soon, Dad," Emma said softly, as if he could hear her. She knew he was at the barracks, but it had become a habit to talk to his picture before leaving. She grabbed the shopping list he had left the night before, stuffing it into the pocket of her worn-out jacket. On the way to the market, the hot asphalt made the air ripple in the distance. Emma's steps were light, almost silent, but steady. She held her head high, as she always did, trying to hide the emptiness she felt from the loss of her mother and her father's constant absence. The voices of people on the street echoed around her, but Emma stayed focused. Entering the market, she grabbed a rusty shopping cart and started walking down the aisles. The wheels squeaked, creating a monotonous sound that echoed in her ears. The shelves were full of products, but Emma's mind was elsewhere. Her fingers lightly touched the cans and boxes as she placed items in the cart, almost on autopilot. "Did I get everything?" she murmured to herself, checking the list in her pocket. When she reached the checkout, an uncomfortable feeling began to grow in her stomach. Something about the atmosphere felt off. The cashier, a young boy who seemed to be Emma's age, watched her with a distant look. She ignored the unease and began placing the items on the conveyor belt. Suddenly, the sharp sound of heavy footsteps approached from behind her. Emma glanced over her shoulder and saw a burly police officer with a severe expression coming towards her. His eyes locked on her in a way that made her heart race. He stopped next to her, staring her up and down as if he were analyzing her. "What are you doing here, girl?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with disdain. He looked directly at Emma, his eyes filled with judgment. Emma tried to remain calm, but she felt a lump forming in her throat. "I'm buying groceries for home, sir." The officer frowned, as if unconvinced. "Groceries? A girl like you alone? Where are your parents?" Emma took a deep breath, keeping her gaze on the officer. "My dad is at work." "Of course he is," the man replied sarcastically, leaning forward. "And you don't seem old enough to be out here on your own. Are you trying to steal something?" The words hit Emma like a punch. She felt her face flush with both shame and anger. "No, sir. I'm not stealing anything. I can pay for all of this." The officer crossed his arms, his brows furrowed. making the atmosphere even heavier. "We'll see about that," he muttered. "Show me the money." With trembling hands, Emma pulled her wallet from her pocket and began counting the bills. Her fingers didn't seem to cooperate, anxiety taking over. The officer's piercing gaze made every movement feel incriminating, even though she knew she was doing nothing wrong. "This is enough," she said with a shaky voice, showing the money. The officer glanced at the bills, but quickly turned his gaze back to Emma, full of suspicion. "Is it? Let's see if this story holds up." He took the bills from her hand, counting them with irritating slowness. "Take your time, girl. I've seen your kind before." The air in the market seemed to grow denser, the uncomfortable silence filling the space. People around them watched, but no one intervened. Emma felt as if every pair of eyes was on her, judging her, condemning her without even understanding what was happening. As the officer humiliated her, Emma wondered if anyone cared about what was happening. She looked around, searching for some form of support, but the people nearby simply looked away, pretending not to see the injustice unfolding in front of them. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Emma whispered, more to herself than to the officer. "That's what they all say," the officer replied with a cynical smile. Before we continue with this powerful story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how you can contribute and help us keep bringing you meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's continue. The atmosphere inside the market seemed to have grown even colder, despite the heat outside. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as the officer stared at her with eyes full of suspicion. She stood still, her trembling hands still clutching the now empty wallet. The silence that had settled around them felt overwhelming, as if time itself had frozen. "I've seen this kind of thing before," the officer continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Girls like you think you can just walk in here, take whatever you want, and leave without paying. That's not happening today, young lady." Emma pressed her lips together, feeling anger bubble inside her. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the feeling of being unjustly accused made her want to scream. She looked around, hoping someone would speak up, that someone would defend her. But the faces of the other people in the market were distant, cold, as if they had decided not to get involved. "I told you already," Emma murmured, her voice firmer now. "I have money. I'm just here to buy food for home." The officer took a step closer, his presence intimidating, and leaned toward Emma. The strong smell of sweat and the leather of his belt made Emma shrink back involuntarily. "Oh yeah? And you think your word means anything? You think I'll just let you walk out of here?" The sound of Emma's breathing seemed too loud in her own ears. She felt her heart pounding hard, each beat sounding like a distant drum echoing inside her chest. The crumpled bills were still in the officer's hand, now mixed with his rough fingers, which seemed to test the texture of the notes, as if expecting them to crumble under his touch. "I just want to go home," Emma said, her voice now barely a whisper. She didn't want to fight, didn't want to cause trouble. All she wanted was to get out of there, away from that accusing stare. "You're not going anywhere," the officer interrupted, raising a heavy hand and gripping Emma's arm tightly. The rough touch made her skin burn, and she tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. "Stay put, girl. We're going to sort this out right here." Emma's shopping cart, which had been stationary beside her, was kicked aside by the officer, knocking some of the items to the floor. The sound of cans rolling across the linoleum floor echoed through the market, drawing the attention of a few more people who looked on curiously. Yet still, no one intervened. "Please," Emma begged, feeling the pain in her arm intensify as the officer pulled her closer. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about what you think you did. It's about what I see. And I see someone who needs to be taught a lesson." Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry and tight. Sweat began to form beads on her forehead, and her vision seemed to blur for a moment. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, and the fear she felt seemed to fill every space around her, compressing her chest. "You're not going anywhere until I've checked everything properly," the officer growled, beginning to rummage through Emma's shopping bag, tossing the items to the ground carelessly. "Let's see what else you're hiding." The humiliation was unbearable. The ground seemed to open beneath Emma's feet, and she felt as if she were going to collapse at any moment. The officer's hands rifled through her things, discarding the items as if they were insignificant. The people around them watched as if they were witnessing a spectacle, and Emma knew that, to them, she was nothing more than the villain in a story they didn't even know. "There's nothing in there," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm telling the truth." But her words seemed pointless. The officer ignored her protest and continued inspecting every item as if expecting to find some proof of guilt. Emma wanted to cry, but she refused to give that satisfaction to the man treating her like a criminal. Instead, she tried to focus on her breathing to remain calm. "Are you sure this is everything?" the officer asked, his voice full of sarcasm as he looked at the last of the items on the ground. Emma's throat tightened even more. "Yes, that's all." He straightened up, finally releasing her arm. But the look he gave her was still full of disdain. "I guess we won't need to arrest you this time," he said, as if granting her mercy. Relief came quickly, but indignation took its place. She knew the officer had no reason to treat her that way, and the thought of being judged unfairly consumed her. Her body was tense, and the red marks on her arm were the physical evidence of a moment that felt much bigger than anyone around her could understand. "You can't do this," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "You can't treat me like this just because you think I'm different." The officer stared at her, his eyes gleaming with coldness. "I think you should be grateful I'm not taking you to the station right now." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a loud, firm voice echoed through the market. "What's going on here?" The voice seemed to cut through the heavy air, and everyone around turned to look. The officer straightened up, and for the first time, something close to hesitation crossed his face. Emma looked toward the entrance of the market and saw the silhouette of a figure she knew very well. Her father, Oliver Jones, still dressed in his impeccable military uniform, standing tall with a steely expression on his face, was there. The market, which had been filled with whispers and accusing glances, fell completely silent. The officer released Emma's bag and took a step back, his eyes now fixed on the imposing figure walking toward them. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone in the market was holding their breath. The floor seemed to vibrate under Oliver's boots as he approached, his firm steps echoing in the space that, until that moment, had been filled with humiliation and oppression. Emma, her arm still throbbing from where the officer had grabbed her, felt a wave of relief seeing her father, but also a new form of apprehension. She knew what this meant. The situation was far from being resolved. Oliver stopped in front of the officer, who now seemed to struggle to maintain his composure. He looked at his daughter first, his eyes scanning every detail, every trace of discomfort on her face. Emma could see the controlled fury glowing in the depths of her father's eyes, but outwardly, he remained calm. "What exactly is going on here?" Oliver's voice was deep, cold, making the officer take a step back. He refused to break eye contact, which only heightened the discomfort in the air. The officer cleared his throat, trying to appear in control. "This young lady here was acting suspiciously. I needed to check if she was in fact stealing." Oliver narrowed his eyes, his jaw clenching. "Stealing? My daughter was stealing. Well, we're not entirely sure yet." The officer began, but his voice faltered, as if he realized he was losing control of the narrative. He glanced at the items on the floor, scattered after his rough inspection. She seemed nervous, and she was alone. "I thought it best to intervene." Emma looked at her father, feeling a mixture of shame and relief. She knew she shouldn't need her father to defend her, but at that moment, she felt he was her only chance to escape this situation. Oliver stepped forward, dangerously close to the officer, his gaze intense. "My daughter is alone because I've taught her to be independent. She was nervous, because you were intimidating her without any reason." His voice was like steel, and each word was delivered with a precision that pierced the silence around them. "So, explain it to me again. Why do you think you had the right to treat her this way?" The officer swallowed hard, sweat beginning to glisten on his forehead. "Look, sir, I was just doing my job. These situations, you know how it is, they aren't always that clear." Oliver raised an eyebrow, his stance rigid. "You think intimidating a black child alone in the market is part of your job? Do you think you're protecting society by terrorizing a 13-year-old girl?" The words hung in the air for a moment, and Emma saw the officer's shoulders slump slightly. He was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation, but still, he tried to maintain some semblance of control. "That wasn't my intention," he started, but Oliver interrupted him. "It wasn't your intention?" Oliver's voice was louder now, sharp as a blade. "Then what was your intention? Because what I see here is a man with a badge and a gun, who thinks he can act with impunity against a child simply because of the color of her skin." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to fail him. He looked around, searching for some kind of support, but the looks from the customers in the market had changed. Now, they stared at him with a mix of reproach and discomfort. No one was going to come to his aid. The heavy silence was broken by Emma, who, with a trembling voice, finally found the strength to speak. "I didn't do anything wrong, Dad. He didn't believe me. Just because I was alone," and she couldn't finish the sentence. But the pain in her voice was enough to dissolve any remaining doubt. Oliver turned to his daughter, his eyes softening for a brief moment. "I know, sweetheart. I know you didn't do anything." He placed a firm, comforting hand on her shoulder, giving her a sense of security she hadn't felt since the incident began. He turned his attention back to the officer, his voice now deadly calm. "You're going to apologize to my daughter. Now." The officer looked visibly rattled. His hands, once steady at his sides, now fidgeted uncertainly. I'm sorry if there was any misunderstanding, sir. I was just doing my job, you know." Oliver stepped even closer, and the tension in the air became unbearable. "That's not enough. You're not apologizing because you believe you were wrong. You're apologizing because you got caught. And this isn't over." His voice had a finality to it, as if he already knew the inevitable outcome of the situation. Emma felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Her arm still hurt, and the shame of being treated like that in public made her want to disappear. But at the same time, she was incredibly grateful her father was there, that he had shown up exactly when she needed him most. The officer, now completely disoriented, nodded his head, trying to maintain some dignity. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to offend anyone. It was a mistake. I won't do it again." "You're right," Oliver responded immediately, the iciness in his voice making the officer shiver. "You won't do it again?" The atmosphere around them seemed to have completely transformed. The officer, who had once exuded power and control, was now just a shrunken figure before an authority he couldn't intimidate. Oliver held his gaze for a few more seconds. Then, with a swift movement, he picked up the shopping bag from the floor and handed it to Emma. "Let's get out of here," he said calmly to his daughter, who nodded silently. As they walked out of the market, Emma could still feel the eyes of the people on her. But now, instead of disdain or judgment, there was a strange mixture of empathy and shame. Her father's presence had completely changed the course of events, but the weight of what had happened still hung over her shoulders. The market's automatic doors closed behind them with a mechanical sigh, and the sound of Emma and Oliver's footsteps faded into the echo of the city. Outside the market, the air was warm and heavy, but the atmosphere between Emma and her father was colder than the occasional breeze that blew through the street. Oliver walked silently beside his daughter, his steps measured and calculated. He knew that what had happened in the market was just the tip of the iceberg, and something inside him was about to explode. Emma walked with her head down, clutching the shopping bag tightly, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the humiliation. The grip on her arm, the officer's words, the judgmental stares from the people around her. It all seemed to echo in her ears like an endless refrain. "What he did was wrong," Oliver said, finally breaking the silence, his voice deep and controlled. He stopped walking and looked directly at his daughter, who still kept her eyes on the ground. "You know that, right?" Emma also stopped, but she didn't lift her head. She bit her lip, hesitant. "Yeah, I know," she replied softly, but her words felt empty, as if she were trying to convince herself. There was a weight on her shoulders she couldn't quite explain. "But this always happens, Dad. I'm used to it." Those words hit Oliver like a punch to the chest. He felt a deep pain hearing that his daughter, so young, was already used to the kind of injustice she had just faced. He knelt slowly in front of Emma, gripping her shoulders firmly, but with a protective gentleness. "Emma, look at me," he said, his voice now softer but filled with urgency. When his daughter's eyes finally met his, he saw something that broke him. The look of resignation, of a child who had already learned to expect the worst from the world. "You can't get used to this. You can't understand. It's not normal. It's not right." Emma blinked, tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. "But what can I do, Dad? I'm just me. They always look at me like that. Like I'm always wrong. Like I'm not like them." Oliver's heart tightened hearing his daughter's painful confession. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had faced it all his life, but he had always tried to shield Emma from that reality. However, seeing her deal with it so early in life was a blow he wasn't prepared for. "You're strong, Emma," he said, his voice firm but laced with emotion. "Stronger than you know. And what happened today, we're going to fight that. We won't let them treat you like that." Emma shook her head slowly. "But fighting doesn't change anything. They'll always be like that." Oliver fell silent for a moment, reflecting on his daughter's words. He knew that, in some ways, she was right. The fight against racism and injustice was a battle he, as a black man, had fought all his life. But he also knew that giving up was not an option. Not for him. And definitely not for Emma. "I know it seems that way now," he said, taking a deep breath, trying to contain his own anger and frustration. "But giving up only gives them more power. Every time you stand up, every time you refuse to be treated as less, you force them to confront their own failures." Emma's eyes began to glisten with new tears, but she still stood strong. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to seem weak. "We're going to do something about this, Emma," Oliver continued, gently squeezing her shoulders. "We're going to the station, and that officer will be held accountable. He can't just do what he did and walk away." Emma looked up at her father, surprised. "But do you think they'll believe me? Believe us?" Oliver took another deep breath, his gaze intensifying. "They'll have to believe us. I'm a captain in the army. I know how these things work, and I'll make sure my daughter's voice is heard." For a moment, Emma felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest, but it was quickly dampened by doubt. "And if nothing happens? What if they think I'm exaggerating? That you're exaggerating?" Oliver slowly stood up, his face now hardened with determination. "Then we keep fighting, every time it happens. Every time they try to bring you down. We won't give up, Emma, no matter what." The sound of a car speeding down the street made Emma glance away for a moment. The world felt so vast and at the same time so small in that instant. She knew her father wanted to protect her, but she also knew the world outside wouldn't change so easily. "I just wanted to be normal, you know," she said in a whisper, more to herself than to her father. "I wish I could just walk around without people looking at me like I'm different." Oliver, with sadness in his eyes, placed a gentle hand on Emma's head, stroking her hair. "I know, sweetheart. I know." The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets around them. The heat still lingered in the air, but there was a coldness in that moment, as if the weight of the world had fallen on them. "Let's go home," Oliver finally said, taking the shopping bag from Emma's hands. "Tomorrow we'll deal with this, but for now, you deserve a rest." Emma nodded, feeling a slight wave of relief. She knew the battle wasn't over, but at least, in that moment, she had the comfort of her father by her side. Night had fallen, and the silence inside the small house was almost deafening. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the mug of tea that was slowly cooling in her hands. Her father, Oliver, stood leaning against the sink, his arms crossed as he watched his daughter in silence. "I know you're worried about what's going to happen tomorrow," Oliver finally said, his voice low and controlled, but filled with the tenderness only a father could express. Emma lifted her eyes from the mug, meeting her father's attentive gaze. "It's just that. I don't know if it's worth it," she admitted, the words leaving her mouth with a mix of hesitation and frustration. "What if they just don't care?" Oliver let out a deep sigh and uncrossed his arms, moving toward the table. He sat down beside Emma, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. "I understand how you're feeling, Emma. I know how hard it is to believe that anything will change." He paused, searching for the right words to comfort his daughter without extinguishing the fire that still burned inside him. "But we have to do our part. Even when it feels like no one cares, we have to believe that our voice can make a difference." Emma looked at her father, her eyes reflecting the internal battle she was fighting. She wanted to believe him, wanted to find some meaning in all of this, but the exhaustion and frustration weighed heavily on her shoulders. "I just don't want to go through that again," she said, her voice almost breaking. "I don't want them to look at me like that again, like I'm invisible or worse, like I'm worthless." Oliver reached out and placed his hand over Emma's, squeezing it gently. "You've never been invisible to me, and you're not invisible to this world either. They're wrong, Emma. The people who treat you like that, they're wrong. But you can't let their vision define you." The silence fell between them once again, but this time it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a moment of understanding between father and daughter, where words seemed insufficient to express the complexity of the pain and struggle they both faced. The next morning started early for both of them. The sky was still tinged with a pale blue when Oliver put on his military uniform with precision, adjusting every detail. Emma watched him in silence, admiring the confidence he exuded, even in moments of uncertainty. "Ready?" Oliver asked, turning to his daughter. He held out his hand to her, a gesture that felt both protective and encouraging. Emma nodded, taking her father's hand as she rose from the couch. "Yeah, ready," she replied, though her heart was racing. The drive to the police station was quiet, with only the sound of the tires on the asphalt filling the space. Emma stared out the window, the familiar cityscape passing by in a blur. The people on the sidewalks seemed distant, as if they lived in another world, one where injustice wasn't a daily reality. When they arrived at the station, the brown brick building seemed more imposing than Emma had imagined. There was something about the atmosphere of the place that made her feel small again, as if she was about to be swallowed by a system far larger than she could comprehend. Oliver squeezed Emma's hand gently, offering her reassurance. "Remember, we're here for you. What happened was wrong, and they need to know that." Emma took a deep breath and followed her father to the reception desk. The atmosphere inside the station was cold and impersonal. The air smelled of old coffee and disinfectant, and the sound of typing echoed through the hallways. A woman in a navy blue uniform, with a serious expression, sat behind the desk. She looked up as Oliver approached, her expression neutral but professional. "Good morning, how can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone polite but distant. Oliver kept his gaze steady, though his voice remained controlled. "I'd like to file a complaint against one of your officers. My daughter was unjustly harassed while shopping yesterday afternoon, and this needs to be investigated." The woman raised an eyebrow, surprised by the straightforward statement. "I see. Who was the officer involved?" "I don't know his name, but he was the officer at the Central Market yesterday around 5 in the afternoon," Oliver replied, his voice still calm but with an authoritative tone that left no room for argument. The woman typed a few things into her computer as Emma anxiously watched every move. The sound of the keyboard seemed too loud in her ears, each click amplifying her apprehension. "I'll need you to fill out some forms and wait a bit. We'll investigate the situation," the woman said, sliding a clipboard with papers toward them. While Oliver filled out the documents, Emma looked around. There were other officers walking through the corridors, each focused on their own tasks. But every so often, she noticed quick glances in her direction, as if she was out of place, a deviation from the routine of the station. "This is normal," Oliver said quietly, without looking up from the clipboard. "They'll act like this is an inconvenience." "But you're not an inconvenience, Emma." She tried to focus on her father's words, but the discomfort was palpable. The environment, the people, everything seemed designed to make her feel insignificant, as if her story was just another item on the day's to-do list. Finally, after filling out the documents, the woman at the desk instructed them to wait. "Someone will contact you soon," she said, the impersonal tone returning to her voice. Oliver thanked her, but Emma felt the weight of uncertainty settling in again. As they left the station, the sun was stronger, but the heat offered no comfort. "Now what?" she asked, her voice heavy with frustration. "Now we wait," Oliver replied, but Emma could see the same frustration on her father's face. "But this is just the beginning. We'll make sure this story isn't forgotten." But deep down, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how hard they tried, the system was already set up to swallow them whole. The following days were marked by an endless wait. The house, normally filled with the quiet routine of Emma and Oliver, now felt suffocated by the weight of uncertainty. Every phone call, every notification made Emma's heart race, only to be followed by frustration when it wasn't the response they were expecting from the police station. Oliver maintained a calm facade, but Emma knew the situation was eating away at him too. She saw it in his tense gestures, in his long stares out the window. In the nights he stayed late at work, as if he was avoiding facing the void of possible disappointment. One morning, while Emma was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, the phone rang. The sound broke the silence abruptly, startling her. Oliver, who was reading the newspaper at the table, looked up, his body instantly alert. Emma hurried to pick up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" Her voice came out weaker than she wanted. "Hello, this is the police station. We would like to speak with Mr. Oliver Jones, please." Emma turned to her father, her eyes wide. "It's the police station," she whispered, quickly handing him the phone. Oliver took the phone firmly, his eyes fixed on Emma as he responded. "Yes, this is he. Any news?" There was a long pause as he listened on the other end of the line. Emma tried to catch something from the conversation, but all she could hear were low, incomprehensible murmurs. She watched her father's face closely, trying to decipher what was being said. As the conversation progressed, she noticed his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with frustration. "I understand," Oliver finally said, his voice tense. "Yes, we'll come in. Thank you." He hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath before turning to Emma. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, her heart beating fast. She could feel something was wrong. Oliver rubbed the back of his neck, a somber expression taking over his face. "They want us to go to the police station. Apparently, the officer involved in the situation is claiming that you were aggressive with him and that he acted in self-defense." Emma froze, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Aggressive? He's lying." Her voice rose, and she felt the blood rushing through her veins. "I didn't do anything, Dad. He was intimidating me." "I know, Emma, I know," Oliver quickly reassured her, trying to calm her down. "But it seems they're trying to turn this into a case of your word against his." Emma slumped into the chair, feeling crushed by the injustice of it all. How can they believe him? He's the one who's guilty, and I'm just a kid. They can't do this. Oliver sat beside her, his expression grave, but his voice carried a forced calmness. "They can try, Emma, but that doesn't mean they'll succeed. We'll go there. We'll clarify everything. I'll be by your side the whole time." Emma ran her hands through her hair, trying to process the information. The world seemed to be spinning around her, and the sense of powerlessness was returning with full force. "Why is it always like this?" she asked, her voice a broken whisper. "Why do they always manage to come out on top, even when they're wrong?" Oliver looked at his daughter, and for the first time in a long while, his eyes showed something beyond determination. There was exhaustion, a deep weariness from years of similar battles. "Because the system was made to protect them," he said slowly. "But that doesn't mean we're going to give up." The drive to the police station was once again made in silence. The tension between them was palpable, and Emma felt as though she was about to explode. Every corner they turned seemed to take them deeper into a reality from which she couldn't escape. When they arrived at the police station, the same woman at the reception was there, but this time there was something different in her expression, a coldness, as if she had already decided whose side she was on. "Mr. Jones, Miss Jones," she greeted them formally, without any warmth. "Please, follow me." They were led to a small, dimly lit room, with a table in the center and 2 chairs on each side. On the other side of the room, already seated, was the officer who had humiliated Emma. His arrogant eyes showed no remorse or doubt. Next to him sat an older man with a serious, stern demeanor, flipping through some papers. "Mr. Jones, Miss Jones, please have a seat," he said, not lifting his eyes from the documents. Oliver and Emma sat down, and the atmosphere became loaded with almost unbearable tension. Emma could hear the sound of her own breathing and the faint buzz of the flickering light above. She tried to stay calm, but every cell in her body was on the verge of an explosion. "Well, we're here to discuss the events of that day," the man began, finally raising his eyes. "It seems there are discrepancies in the accounts given. The officer claims that he acted according to protocol, in response to a young woman he considered a threat." "A threat?" Oliver repeated, his voice cold and filled with indignation. "He's saying that a 13-year-old girl, alone, unarmed, was a threat to an armed police officer?" The officer, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "She was agitated, acting suspiciously. As a police officer, it's my responsibility to ensure the safety of everyone around." Emma felt her blood boiling. "You grabbed me. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just shopping." The words escaped before she could contain them, her voice trembling with anger. The officer didn't seem fazed. He merely shrugged. "I did what I felt was necessary within my rights." The tension in the room was unbearable, and Emma felt as though the ground was opening beneath her feet. She looked at her father, hoping he would say something, do something to stop this injustice. Oliver took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "We are here because your officer's behavior was unacceptable and racist. He humiliated my daughter without any justifiable reason, and this needs to be dealt with seriously." The older man, who seemed to be the officer's superior, looked around the room before sighing. "We'll investigate the case further, but you must understand that without concrete evidence, this becomes a matter of interpretation. We will keep you informed." Emma's heart sank. Once again, the feeling of powerlessness washed over her like a wave. She knew that, despite the empty promises, the system was inclined to protect those in power. The silence that followed the superior officer's statement was heavy and suffocating. Emma felt her stomach churn. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock in the corner seemed to echo. The vague promise of a thorough investigation seemed like just another way to delay the inevitable, that the injustice would be swept under the rug. Oliver clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the superior officer. He knew exactly what was happening here. He knew the system was designed to protect its own, but that didn't mean he would remain silent. "A thorough investigation?" Oliver repeated, his voice low and full of tension. "What exactly do you need to investigate?" "The facts are clear. This man humiliated my daughter, used unnecessary physical force, and now he's sitting here claiming she was a threat." His eyes flashed with controlled anger. A 13-year-old girl who was just shopping, The superior officer looked at Oliver, clearly uncomfortable with the pressure he was under. The officer sitting beside him, however, kept his arrogant gaze, as if immune to any consequences. "Mr. Jones," the superior officer began, his voice rehearsed and calm, "we take all allegations seriously. However, as I explained, without concrete evidence..." "Concrete evidence?" Emma interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. She couldn't hold back anymore. "I was there. I lived it. He grabbed me, treated me like a criminal, and I'm just a kid." Her words spilled out quickly, and she felt her eyes welling up with tears of rage and frustration. The officer, finally addressing Emma directly, responded with disdain. "I was doing my job, miss. You were behaving suspiciously. Believe me, I've seen this kind of behavior before. This kind of behavior..." Oliver's voice rose now, his posture rigid, chin lifted. "And what kind of behavior would that be exactly? The fact that she's a young black girl alone in a market automatically makes her suspicious? Because that's what it seems like. I can't imagine another explanation for your prejudiced attitude." The officer shrugged, showing no sign of remorse. "I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Oliver laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter, only bitterness. "Your protocol allows you to abuse a child? To use physical force without any reason? Let's be clear here, it wasn't her behavior that bothered you. It was the color of her skin." The superior officer, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, raised his hand to call for calm. "Let's keep this civil, please. We're here to discuss the incident in a constructive manner." "Civil?" Oliver echoed, his tone defiant. He leaned forward in his chair, moving closer to the table. "My daughter was treated like a criminal by this man, without any justification. And now you expect us to accept that this can be discussed with the same indifference he treated her with that day." Emma felt a lump tightening in her throat. Her father's words echoed inside her, amplifying the mix of fear and anger she felt. Her heart was pounding, and the room seemed hotter, more suffocating. The officer beside them continued to wear his cold expression, as if he were above all of this. Emma couldn't understand how someone could be so indifferent to so much pain. The superior officer sighed, glancing at the police officer beside him before turning his attention back to Oliver. "We understand that the situation is delicate, Mr. Jones. We are conducting an internal investigation, and we will handle this with the seriousness it deserves." Oliver stared at him, his eyes burning with controlled fury. "An internal investigation?" He shook his head slowly, incredulous. "You really think that's enough? That an internal report will fix what happened to my daughter? What about all the other children this man has treated the same way?" The officer finally spoke, his voice filled with disdain. "Look, sir, maybe your daughter misinterpreted the situation. Kids like her." "Kids like her?" Emma shot up from her chair abruptly, her voice trembling but filled with strength. "What do you mean by that? I know what you're insinuating, and I'm tired of it. You think you can treat me like this, treat anyone who looks like me like this, and get away with it?" The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Emma's outburst. But before he could respond, Oliver also stood up. "Enough." His voice was low but powerful. "You've just incriminated yourself with your own words. Kids like her," he repeated, his eyes locked onto the officer. "You don't even bother hiding your prejudice. And that's what makes you dangerous." The superior officer seemed uneasy, his eyes darting between Emma, Oliver, and the police officer. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control. "Gentlemen, please." "No." Oliver raised his hand, cutting the superior officer off. "No more excuses. No more empty promises of investigations. I will take this beyond this room, and I will make sure this man faces the consequences of what he's done." The officer tried to respond, but Oliver cut him off before he could speak. "You think you can do this because the system is on your side, and maybe it is, but I won't stand by while you destroy the self-esteem and dignity of children like my daughter. Because this isn't the first time, is it? And if it's up to me, it will be the last." Emma looked at her father, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had never seen him so firm, so relentless. In that moment, she knew that no matter what happened next, her father would be there to protect her, to fight for her. The superior officer, clearly realizing that the situation was out of control, cleared his throat. "Mr. Jones, we understand your frustration. We will review all the evidence and handle the case with the seriousness it deserves." Oliver shook his head. "I've heard that before." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on both the superior officer and the police officer. "If you don't do what's right, I will make sure the truth comes out. You won't be able to hide what happened here. I promise." With that, Oliver took Emma's hand and gently pulled her, leading her out of the room. As they left, Emma felt as though she could breathe again. The suffocating weight of the room began to lift, but the fight was far from over. As they stepped out of the police station, the fresh air of the street surrounded them, and Emma let out a deep sigh, feeling a mix of relief and tension. She looked at her father, who still held his determined expression. "Dad," she began, her voice soft but firm, "thank you for standing up for me." Oliver looked back at her, his face softening a little. "I will always stand up for you, Emma. Always." The sound of Emma and Oliver's footsteps echoed along the sidewalk as they walked away from the police station. The afternoon was fading, and the shadows of the trees danced softly in the light breeze. Emma walked in silence beside her father, still processing the weight of the confrontation at the station. The world around her felt distant, as if everything was moving in slow motion while emotions surged within her. "Do you think this will lead to anything?" Emma finally asked, her voice low and hesitant. She could still feel the tight knot of frustration in her throat. Oliver took a deep breath, not looking directly at his daughter, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, Emma, but what I do know is that we did what was right. They may try to hide it, try to divert attention, but the truth is on our side." Emma nodded slightly, but there was still a weight on her chest. The system seemed so unbreakable, so cruelly tilted against people like her. She looked down at the ground, the dry leaves crunching under her feet as she tried to find some comfort in her father's words. "I just want it to be over," she whispered. "I want to live my life without having to worry about things like this, without being seen as if I'm less than." Oliver stopped abruptly and turned to face his daughter. He knelt down in front of Emma, holding her hands firmly. His eyes, tired but full of love, met hers with intensity. "Emma, listen to me," he began, his voice filled with a tenderness only a father could express. "You have never been and will never be less than anyone. What happened today, what has been happening, is not because of who you are. It's because of who they are. They are wrong, and you cannot let their narrow, prejudiced view define who you are." Tears began to silently fall down Emma's face, but she didn't try to wipe them away. "But it hurts, Dad. It hurts so much, always having to fight, always having to prove that I'm worthy." Oliver stood up and pulled Emma into a tight embrace, wrapping her fully in his arms. "I know it hurts," he whispered into her ear, "and I wish I could take that pain away from you. But the only thing you need to know is that you are worthy, and I'll be here, fighting alongside you, until the end." For a moment, the world stopped. The weight of the injustice they had faced seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the sense of safety in Oliver's arms. Emma closed her eyes, allowing herself to be comforted by her father's strength. A few weeks passed, and Emma's life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, the incident at the market and the confrontation at the station still loomed over her like a constant shadow. The promise of an investigation felt more like a formality, and the frustration of seeing no change began to wear on her patience. One afternoon, while Emma was studying in the living room, the sound of firm knocks at the door interrupted her concentration. She got up slowly, and when she opened the door, she was surprised to see two uniformed officers. They carried none of the arrogance of the man who had caused so much pain. "Good afternoon. "We're here to speak with Mr. Oliver Jones," one of the officers said politely, his expression serious but respectful. Emma felt her stomach churn. She nodded and called for her father, who soon appeared, surprised by the unexpected visit. "How can I help you?" Oliver asked, standing tall but with a cautious tone. "We'd like to inform you that the officer involved in the incident with your daughter has been suspended while we conduct a full investigation," one of the officers said formally. After reviewing the market security footage and hearing testimony from several witnesses, it was determined that the officer's conduct does not align with the standards of our police force. Emma, standing at the door, felt a wave of shock pass through her. She looked at her father, who remained calm, but there was a slight expression of relief in his eyes. "Does this mean he'll be held accountable?" Oliver asked, his tone controlled, but filled with expectation. "Yes, sir," the other officer replied. "We are recommending a severe disciplinary review, and he may face further consequences, depending on the final investigation's outcome." Emma's heart raced. For the first time in weeks, it seemed that justice was finally starting to be served. "Thank you for informing us," Oliver responded, maintaining his firm stance. "We'll be following this closely." The officers nodded and took their leave, leaving Emma and Oliver alone at the door. Emma was still in shock from what she had just heard. "Dad, does this mean?" Oliver smiled slightly and placed a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "It means we're starting to see results. It's not over yet, but it's a step." Emma looked down, processing everything. The feeling of relief began to mix with a new sensation, a small but growing sense of hope. "You were right, Dad," she said with a timid smile. The truth came out. Oliver pulled her into a hug, his voice soft but firm. "The truth always comes out, Emma. It may take time, it may be painful, but it always finds a way." As they stood there, embraced in the doorway of their home, Emma finally felt something she hadn't in a long time. Lightness, a sense that despite all the struggles, there was hope. And that was enough for her to keep going. Emma's story reminds us of the harsh reality that many face every day. Prejudice, discrimination, and racism are present everywhere, and situations like this show us that the fight for equality is far from over. But it also teaches us that even when injustice seems unbeatable, the truth has a transformative power. Oliver, Emma's father, didn't stay silent in the face of oppression, and his courage is an example of how we must act. The world may try to knock us down, but together we can face any obstacle. And remember, never underestimate the power of your voice. If you've experienced something similar, know that you're not alone. Let's keep fighting for a more just and equal world. If you like this story and want to see more content like this, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on this story.